Hi guys, hope you're enjoying the podcast so far. Might have to change up the frequency a little bit coming into the holiday season. Just let me prioritize some other projects as well, but I'll continue to do things maybe monthly or fortnightly depending on the demand and questions. So today we're looking at Zone 2 training, and I'm going to provide some context around kettlebell training and Zone 2. Basically, a recent article came out critiquing a lot of podcasters' points of view on Zone 2 training. And this was sent to me by a good friend of mine, Nick, who sort of has a pretty good idea of my biases and things like that, which is I typically favor interval training or more intense training. But I'll put the article link in the show notes if you want to check it out. But basically, to provide some context, a lot of Zone 2 training is really used a lot in elite endurance performance athletes, and they're doing huge volumes. And as the name implies, they're doing some high intensity training and lots of low intensity, higher volume. But their low intensity training is probably more intense than most people's regular training. Depending if you think of a runner or a rower or something like that, or a cyclist, even something like that, there's probably good examples there. So when you apply this sort of Zone 2 model to someone who's only doing 2 or 3 sessions a week, you're probably better off doing higher intensity stuff because you get more bang for your buck with smaller volume and intensity. And typically, how it's used in endurance athletes from a sort of mechanistic adaptation sort of level, which is where we would probably think about it more for kettlebells, because most people aren't doing too much Zone 2 training for their actual kettlebell training. It's more their cross training. So the idea is we're trying to get some of those peripheral adaptations, or getting the mitochondrial biogenesis, switching all that stuff on, trying to get more mitochondria or greater volume of mitochondria, which supposedly low intensity stuff is good for. But if you're doing low intensity training by itself, it might not be enough to make an impact, or particularly Zone 2 type stuff. So in that sense, it's sort of you want to think about what you can recover from. So I always like to think about starting with higher intensity stuff. So if you're just new to exercise, by all means, starting really easy and light. We get what's called the repeated bouts effect, which is a protective effect against muscle damage, or DOMS, I should say, delayed onset muscle soreness. And that's a great place for us to start, and we can incrementally load on top of that. So starting with a Zone 2 or a walk run or anything like that is a great way to start. With kettlebell training, you probably fall out of Zone 2 very easily. Now, sometimes there's issues if you're really doing Zone 2. People talk a lot about doing Zone 2, but the reality is Zone 2 is often used as so we have a 5-zone model, I should say, and a 3-zone model. And the 3-zone model is using the physiological markers. So you've got your aerobic threshold, or first lactate threshold, or whatever you want to call it. And this lines up with your ventilatory threshold, or your VT1. And this is typically the first point where you start to notice an increase above resting levels of blood lactate, or there's a noticeable increase in your breathing rate. And I covered this in one of my blogs, Running and Kettlebell Sport Part 2. So you can have a closer look at that. But then as we move along, there is sort of our second thresholds. But Zone 2 essentially breaks that first threshold down. So basically training at the high end of Zone 2, you're just on that sort of threshold. And that's a great place to be, particularly if you're looking to do contrasting stuff. So if you're doing intense kettlebell training, it's really good to contrast with lighter stuff, assuming you can recover from it. So it could be useful for recovery, or yeah, maybe you're trying to get some more volume to get some more of those peripheral adaptations. Lower intensity training can also be useful for switching on that parasympathetic nervous system. So these are all just different things to consider. Are you really doing zone two? If you're just using that heart rate version, you you might be in zone two, but you might not be going after or in that sort of zone or physiological stressing point that a lot of people advocate for it when they talk about this stuff. So that's another thing to consider, and I'd encourage you to check out my blog for a bit more detail on that. So for most people, and in most events, um, oxygen delivery is more of a limiting factor than oxygen extraction. So we've got our central component, which is sort of the heart pumping out blood, and the blood taking the oxygen to the muscle, and then the peripheral, we sort of consider the taking oxygen out of the blood. So um, the the limiting factor is typically, that oxygen delivery. Um, this the the lungs and things, it can sort of change in different environments such as altitude and things like that. But when we consider technique and kettlebell sport, if you don't have good flexibility, so you can't relax in certain positions, so you're really tight and tense, that's going to make it harder for the blood to penetrate in. So and then allow sort of the muscle to take out all that oxygen. So we're not getting that what we call perfusion. Um, so the blood's having a harder time navigating through the capillaries and things like that. So if we say are in the rack position and we've got bent legs or are really contracting our quads really hard, the blood will have a harder time getting in there. So when you think about it in this sense, you can kind of think about technique and efficiency, and you're probably not being very efficient here. And in this circumstance, maybe the oxygen extraction is a limiting factor. Um, so that that's something to consider. Maybe there's some other things we can work on to improve your fitness, such as your flexibility. And zone two training in the context of kettlebell training is, yeah, like I mentioned before, really good. Classic way people do sort of thing is 3 kettlebell sessions a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then on the other days or the day after, or Thursday, Tuesday, Thursday, possibly Saturday, they do an easier, longer session. And maybe you don't have to be exactly in that zone two. You can push it up a little bit, but just think about what you can recover from. So, zone one or zone two is a great place to start. And then, as long as it's not affecting your performance, incrementally increasing up. And again, thinking about um, whatever you can recover from. So you don't want to push it above that, and you'll see it in your performance if that starts to go down. But you may even like to progress to interval training. Doesn't have to be sprint interval training. And if you think about that polarized model, maybe you consider or you do all your intense stuff on the kettlebell days. So you might do some jerks and then do a couple of squats and follow that up with some bike sprints on one day. Another day you might do snatches and some intense rowing. So you're sort of using similar muscle groups, but then on the off days, maybe do your easy cycling or easy running, depending on how you're trying to spread those different modalities. I I rarely I rarely recommend running sprints unless you are a runner um, or a sprinter, I should say. Unless you do that regularly, the risk of calf injuries or doing too much too soon can be a bit much. Sometimes repeat 1Ks at a moderate to fast pace are okay, but typically you just build up to it slowly, particularly if you're thinking like 40-meter sprints and things like that. But again, for cross training, I think it's probably not a bad place to contrast your intense kettlebell training. But if you only train, say, 3 days a week, I probably wouldn't recommend, unless you're really struggling to recover, substituting out one of the kettlebell sessions for a cross training easy session. Or you might find it's very hard to do kettlebell training in zone two because kettlebell training typically has a higher heart rate when you match the oxygen cost with running. So um, that's just something to consider, is that it might be slightly skewed anaerobically with kettlebell training. There isn't too much research on this, but there's a few studies on the swing and one on the kettlebell snatch, which was compared to rowing, and the kettlebell um, snatch actually had slightly higher heart rate during a ramped test um, compared to rowing, slightly lower heart rate, but had ever so slightly higher oxygen consumption. And this was in novices, I believe, using a 16 kilo. So this might change with more experienced people. That sort of factor will wash out. So again, the signaling. So that's sort of quite a complicated thing, but often people talk about that. So over time, well, your body senses a range of different things happening there, and if there's a large buildup in the muscle of calcium, then that can trigger the mitochondrial biogenesis, or your body increasing um, or volume of mitochondria, things like that. But that can take a lot of volume. So that's where sometimes you get diminishing returns, or you need to consider the time cost of that sort of training. And in the context of elite athletes, it's not a problem for them to jump on a bike for 2+ hours, things like that, to contrast their sprints. Versus a low energy sort of signal, you can even deplete a substantial amount of energy just with one 30-second max sprint, assuming it is max. Sometimes just as many as, well, low volume interval training or sprint interval training can be really effective with under 5 minutes of work, such as the Tabata kind of protocol, which everyone knows about. But even 4-second sprints repeated, or 30-second sprints repeated with slightly longer recovery, can all be really useful. So just think about the time cost there as well. So basically, to summarize, zone training, if you do it by itself, is probably not very good. Zone training for cross training with kettlebells is probably a great place to be, but you can increase the intensity. You don't always have to stick exactly in that zone 2. You can bump it up, push a bit above the threshold. Typically, if you're trying to improve your VO2 max, training at or around your VO2 max is the best way to do that. But again, also consider what limits your endurance. If it's flexibility, maybe that's something that you can alter and work on to improve your efficiency. If you're doing kettlebell training and trying to hold zone 2, unless you're really experienced, that might be quite tricky, and it might be incredibly light. So that's just something to consider. And if you think about that signaling, it takes a long time to build up the that amount of calcium to get that signaling, to get that cascade of events to happen. So that's a limitation there, but ultimately the proof will be in the pudding. You can just see how you go with your training, and if it's improving, or if you feel like you're setting yourself up for success, you can by all means do that. But again, that would be quite a harder one to do. So again, contrasting intense kettlebell training with easier cross training is probably the place to be. Hope you enjoy this one. Let me know if you've got any more questions, and you can check out the articles if you want any more detail. Cheers. Bye.